Welcome everyone to the second day of the Iowa Ideas Conference. It's great to be back, and I'm glad to have so many people back here this morning. I'm Erin Jordan. I'm an investigative reporter for the Gazette. I have the pleasure of moderating this morning's session on reforestation strategies, which is part of the energy and environment track of the conference. So we have a fantastic panel, an international panel, and we'll let them introduce themselves in just a moment. But I want to remind you guys, just submit questions on Whova and we will integrate them as the conversation goes along, not necessarily save them till the end. And so we'll have time to really talk with these panelists over the next hour here. So I want to start and ask each panelist to briefly introduce him or herself and describe your connection to reforestation. Let's start with our local panelist, Shannon Ramsey.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you for your personal interest in trees and forest. And I am the founding president of Trees Forever, and we started actually in Cedar Rapids and Marion. We work across Iowa and Illinois and do some national things as well. We're very volunteer-based, and I think it's going to take an army of volunteers to replant. Anyway, glad to be here today. So looking forward to questions and getting into strategy.
Jeff, do you want to go next?
He's muted. Jeff, I think you're muted.
And just to tell the panelists, you don't have to mute yourself. We'll just all be unmuted during the
Thank you. I've now been unmuted. I'm Jeff Speck. I'm a city planner. I'm based in Boston, Massachusetts. I have some history in Iowa, in part because my wife is from Davenport, but I've spent a lot of time there, and also in Cedar Rapids, where I worked on a plan for the downtown streets. My connection to this panel is that Shannon and other folks in Cedar Rapids have brought me in to work on a plan to relief, we're calling it Relief Cedar Rapids, after the devastation from the derecha. So I've been very focused on this issue. Lately, I think my main qualification is just that I really love trees. And as a city planner, and in my books and other things, I've written a lot about how important and essential trees are to healthy communities.
Well, Priscilla, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Priscilla Files. I'm the executive director and the senior arborist for the Galveston Island Tree Conservancy. Galveston Island is, if you don't know where we are, we're a small island off the coast of Texas. So we say Galveston near Texas, in the Gulf of Mexico. One of the reasons I'm here on this panel is because back in 2008, Hurricane Ike came through and its storm surge killed over 50% of the trees on the island. So we've been in a mission to reforest the island since then. And I work closely with the city and other entities like the Texas A&M Forest Service and Master Gardeners.
Julie?
Hi, so I'm Julie Guimond. I am your international panelist, which is such an honor. However, I think I'm probably a 3-hour drive from the US border. So I have a master's in ecology and have worked both federal, provincial, and municipal governments, as well as in nonprofits, similar to many of my peers in this panel. I have a strong passion for really connecting people to our environment, our nature, and open spaces, and have been doing that through leading volunteers and education and play, and now through trees. So my current role is that I lead a team of 100 arborists with the city of Calgary, and similar to what Galveston has gone through and what Cedar Rapids is going through right now, we led a retreat effort back starting in 2014 after a major storm. And we have rethought how we do our strategy for urban forestry as a line of service within the city of Calgary. And so my team's responsible for maintaining, protecting, which is extremely important, planting, and also advocating for that urban forest. And here we have over 500,000 manicured trees, we have natural tree stands, and then we have all the trees that fall under private property, which is extremely important to our urban canopy.
Thank you. And we're going to get more into these stories from Galveston Island and Calgary in a minute. But I wanted to start here locally. On August 10th, Cedar Rapids lost about 65% of its tree canopy. Shannon, you probably know this tree canopy the best. I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about where these trees are located and in general, what types of trees and how many did we lose?
Well, we lost. No area around Cedar Rapids, Marion, Linn County was spared. No neighborhood was spared. So in areas where we had large mature trees like oaks and sycamores, many of those went down, and many of those went down on homes. One of our staff had a huge 75-foot locust that was a gorgeous tree, and she had mentioned like a year ago her neighbors were concerned about it, you know. I don't know, just that it might fall on homes or something. Well, it did go down in the storm, and she ended up with 9 trusses broken. You know, I mean, those are the stories people have. But it's interesting to me, people are not focusing on what the damage to their homes. They're very focused on what they lost with trees. And Erin, they varied from large mature oaks, like I said, to maples, locusts, ginkgos, you know, all just a huge diversity of trees. Our younger trees withstood the storm better, but many of our mature trees, I mean, I think about some of the parks in Cedar Rapids and Marion, they just went down. I mean, it's a war zone. And I do hear people say, you know, you can't imagine how bad it is unless you visited. You can look at all the photos. You can hear that we have well over we're on our way to our 2 billion pounds of debris. And it's just mind-boggling, all the trees and limbs that went down. You know, we're in this stage now where our arborists are out checking the trees to see what we can save and what has to be trimmed and taken down. So our best estimate is over 100,000 trees, and that includes homes as well.
Wow. Wow. Now, Jeff, your 2012 book, Walkable City, talks about how walkability can, you know, save a city. How do trees factor into a city's walkability or of desire of residents to be active?
I would remove walkability, even though it's my thing. I would remove walkability from the conversation and just say, you know, what do trees do? And I talked in my book about all the things that trees do. One of which is to make places more attractive and comfortable and inviting to pedestrians, so they might make the choice to walk somewhere rather than not walk somewhere. But I was much more fascinated by all the other positive things that trees do. Interestingly, some of them you can monetize and other ones you can't. They absorb stormwater in a dramatic way. When, you know, a lot of cities, I know in the Midwest, Milwaukee had a particular problem with CSOs, combined sewage overflows, and, you know, millions of gallons of polluted water flowing into the Great Lakes because of stormwater issues. And trees are probably the most effective way. It takes a few years, but planting trees are an incredible way to manage stormwater. The first half inch of rainfall on a mature tree is absorbed by that tree. So that's really important. They sequester a ton of carbon. The majority of your tailpipe emissions that are not going up into the atmosphere are being absorbed by trees. Some studies showed 97% of the carbon, I'm going to stumble on this word, sequesterization is being done by trees. One thing that is monetizable is that they increase property values. So one study by the Wharton School of Economics found that they increase property values by 9%, which means that the cities are getting much higher tax revenues as a result of planting trees in communities. The city of Portland found that they get a 12-to-1 payoff. The amount of money that they spend planting trees and taking care of their trees they get 12 times that in increased tax returns due to the increased property values of those trees. And there's many other things. I think I've talked long enough, but so many different ways that trees contribute to the value of our communities.
That makes a lot of sense. I just think about just even lower energy costs with shade and, reduce noise pollution and all sorts of things that make a city more desirable.
The Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Agriculture found that one healthy street tree planted next to a house is the equivalent of having 10 room-sized air conditioners running 24 hours a day in that house during the summer.
Wow. And we need that, with everything going on with climate change and that sort of thing. So as Cedar Rapids starts to develop its plan for reliefing, we want to look at what other communities have been through in similar disasters. So I wanted to take a minute to ask Julie and Priscilla to kind of tell us more. I know you mentioned it during your intros, but maybe we can start with Julie. I know that the effort there in Calgary was because of kind of a freak snowstorm in September, much earlier than was expected. And maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what happened.
Yeah, so in Calgary, back in 2014, we received 28 centimeters or about 11 inches worth of snow over the course of 3 days. And our average snowfall in the month of September, and yes, I know this hits every stereotype of Canada, is actually 4 centimeters. So we do get snow in every month of the year here in Calgary. But it was a vast amount of snow at one point in time, and it was heavy snow, and our leaves had not fallen off of our trees yet. So we now had every single branch of every single tree with a lot of surface area for that heavy wet snow to sit on over the course of 3 days. And very similar to what I heard you say about Cedar Rapids, it was every part of the city. Just the year before, we'd had a major flood through Calgary, and we received an order of magnitude more service requests for emergency service requests to the City of Calgary's 311 line. And what was interesting is we received them in every single community, not just along the river edge, which is what we'd see during the flood. Very similarly, we saw it hit young trees and older trees, but more impact in those communities, those inner city communities that have a much higher canopy. The difference with Calgary is we do not have the diversity of tree species that you have. We're a prairie environment, and so trying to grow trees here is extremely hard. We're committed to it for exactly the reasons that Jeff outlined. So it meant that we had a major effort to clean up, and it took us till about January to do that cleanup phase. But then we went to our city council and we said, we have a few options here. We went out, we moved the hangers, but what do we do next? We can just leave it at that, and now we have wounds on trees that puts them at higher risk, or we can go in, add a little bit of extra money, and do anything that we can do to do that, and to not beat yourself up if it can't be done right away. But these are the moments that we have to say, how do we do it better next time? How do we make ourselves better when we're dealing with the everyday, not in an emergency?
Those are really good points, and that's what's great about us learning from you guys. With climate change, the scientists say we're likely to endure more floods, more storms. Is there concern that a city would invest all this money in new trees and labor, and then the trees get damaged again? How do we make the trees that we plant potentially more resilient to future storms?
Well, one of the things we did is we don't, as a organization, we will not fund or plant a tree that doesn't have an irrigation plan behind it. And see, that was part of the problem with Hurricane Ike on our big major boulevards, is that there wasn't any irrigation there. So now we've completely replanted a 4-mile boulevard with big oaks and some palms, and every single tree has irrigation to it. So we can turn it on if we need to.
Yeah, and similar in the city of Calgary, we look at the sustainability as a whole, whether that is soil volumes in those restricted environments like downtown cores, and trying to work with our our roads team and our main streets and some of those big developers to put in soil cells and trenches instead of those lovely tree coffins that we call vaults. But the other piece that we look at is we took it as an opportunity to diversify our forest, not just from a species diversity, but also from an age structure diversity.
Right.
And being able to take advantage of that when we have a community that every tree is the same age, and I know Calgary is not alone, that we have entire streets that are lined with the same species of trees. That not only puts us at risk for storms, it puts us at risk for major pest infestations. We don't have Dutch elm disease yet here in Calgary. We don't have emerald ash borer, but when those ones come, they will be devastating like they have been in other parts of North America. And how do we prepare ourselves for that? And that comes in that diversification, and it comes in that structural pruning and caring for the trees throughout their life, and thinking about how do we make sure that we have the right pieces in place so that tree can be healthy. It's not just that it goes into the ground and that's the end of its life. And so as the city of Calgary, we're responsible for that maintenance, but on private land, we're not. And that's where we've created e-learning modules for citizens on not just how to pick the right tree for the right location, but how to monitor for pests, how to do corrective pruning. We offer workshops because the health of that private urban forest impacts the health of the public urban forest as well.
Shannon, did you have something you wanted to add there?
Well, we are looking, we are in the plan that we're working with Jeff Speck on for Cedar Rapids. We'll be looking at various guiding principles for the new plan, the new reforestation plan, and what will guide us. Certainly diversity will be one. We want equity in the neighborhoods, and as you mentioned, the investment that Calgary and Galveston has made is tremendous. Cedar Rapids has committed $1 million a year each year for the next 10 years, and that's a substantial increase over the annual budget. But we are planning to raise a lot of private funds for that. Trees Forever launched our Planting Hope campaign, and individuals are being incredibly generous helping with that. And we barely started with the campaign, but it's going to take just a huge effort. I think it's very impressive that Calgary has the neighborhoods involved and private citizens, and that's something that we'll be focusing on. It's resilient neighborhoods will grow resilient trees. We are lucky in Iowa to have fabulous soil and rainfall typically. It is a great climate for growing. So looking at the right species, we'll be very focused on species that support pollinators and wildlife, as well as keystone species, providing kind of a food hub. We'll be thinking about that as well. So lots of things to think about when it comes to, I guess, the crossroads of resilience.
Can I say that it's very fortunate that that Cedar Rapids and Iowa has an organization like Trees Forever. It might not be obvious to the listeners who are in Iowa, but having worked all over the place, I've only once been brought to a community by an organization with tree in the name, and that was Trees Forever in Cedar Rapids, which, by the way, is not just about trees. I was really impressed and surprised to understand. I think you're really a regional planning organization disguised as a tree organization, but the amount of intelligence and research and background that Trees Forever has already been able to tap into means that this will really be a best practices plan. And thanks to Shannon and her colleagues, we've already been introduced and had conversations with some of the national experts, like Doug Tallamy, who wrote this book. Just got it in the mail. Shannon.
Right.
Telling us, stuff that Shannon probably knows already, but a lot of people don't, about how the choice of tree will allow you to maintain your local food web, right? Or to support pollinators. We had a conversation with Doug the other day where he mentioned that that only 14% of native plants are responsible for supporting 90% of your local food web for all the critters in the community. So information like that is going to be really instrumental in allowing us to modify the trees, the city's tree list, and to plant a collection of trees that are young, that are storm resilient, and that will work together to actually potentially make Cedar Rapids one of the most sustainable communities in America by virtue of this unfortunate storm.
Now, I know that the city of Cedar Rapids has a tree inventory, and that was something that Calgary put in place after the storm in 2014. I just was hoping to talk a little bit about what information is in a tree inventory and how communities use it, you know, just in regular times and then after incidents like this.
So, City of Calgary, we have two layers to our tree inventory. We have the internal inventory, which is because we consider trees assets, not landscape features. We inventory every manicured tree in the city of Calgary, so over 500,000 of them. And in there we have its location, its species, its age. We monitor health condition. We have size, height, DBH, or diameter at breast height. We monitor anything. We keep in there the data on when it was put in and when it became active. So if it was a developer who planted the tree, it might take a couple of years before it gets to be a city asset. We also are able to put into our data inventory hardware that for older heritage trees that maybe have structural issues, and we still want to maintain them in place. The other thing that we're able to do with our inventory, and this was the piece that we really worked on through the retree effort, is we keep history. So most asset management systems, the condition rating is replaced with what the new data is. And for a tree, how that has changed over time is impactful to the health of that tree. To know what work you have done, to know when it was watered, when it was pruned, to know when it was monitored for health and how often has that been done. We look at decay rates of our inventory system. And so for us, all of that information is available in there, and I tax my GIS team quite regularly to make sure that our data, we can maintain that historical data and we actually have access to it. The other piece that we then do with all of our inventory data is we then flip it and we make it public facing, so that any citizen in Calgary on calgary.ca/trees, we have a public facing tree map, and we have this for quite a bit of open data. So to your point about wildlife habitats, we have it for wildlife viewings and ironically roadkill deaths as well, because it's a really good indicator of wildlife movement corridors. And so on that public facing map, people can see similar information about species, condition, the relative value of that tree, so that they understand what the appraised value might be if they're looking at doing a development on their property that would impact that tree. But they can also find out what some of the ecological value is. So we have pushed our data through the iTree information from US Forest Service, and that's publicly available on the map as well. And historically, the data has changed slightly, and so we're working on getting it back on again. Our planned work, so where we're planting in a year, what trees are planned to be pruned in a year, that you can actually go in and see that data from a public standpoint as well, so that you understand what's happening in your community and the work that's going into caring for those trees and the investment that comes from your tax dollars, to be quite honest. Like, we're accountable to that as a municipality, and we take that quite serious.
We have the last actual technical inventory done of the trees on Galveston Island was after the storm, and to monitor the tree death. Right now, our official inventory is in here and on databases on my own computer. But now that we've got enough trees and enough tree canopy going after this time, I'm gonna try to work with all the entities that we can, even to the point of trying to get the city itself to invest in a company to come in. There's all kinds of inventories out there, and there's some wonderful ones, and it just seems like, to me, over the last 5 years, the technology for being able to identify and to put those benefits, all those different benefits, to the layers of a tree canopy is just amazing these days. We had, when the storm came through, it went through one of the richest neighborhoods and the most historic neighborhoods of Galveston, and went through some of the poorest neighborhoods as well. So to that end, the equity aspect of our planting for us is super important, because everybody needs the trees, but especially certain areas that don't have the privilege that the other areas do. So, so that as far as inventories go, inventory is a super huge tool to have in your pocket. And it sure would be nice to be able to see that pollinator aspect and the wildlife aspect, because we're on the migratory bird route. We get huge birders. So anybody out there is a birder, come on down to Galveston in late March through April.
Hey, Priscilla, I think I will be coming down there.
Cool.
And kind of look at what you guys have done. But I have read a lot about the birding there. And of course, oaks being the #1 species for wildlife, for feeding wildlife, they are the magical food hub, live oaks. And the oaks in the Midwest, the bur oaks, and white oaks and red oaks, I mean, they are just huge. We refer to them as meadows in the sky, because they really are, because their canopies are so huge. And we're going to have to regrow some of that. But anyway.
Priscilla, I want to say, I was scheduled to be in Galveston this April.
Oh, wow.
And unfortunately, that family trip was canceled. Precisely to go to a private, someone's home, but on Galveston Island, that he's turned into a nature preserve, which apparently has incredible.
I know who you're talking about.
Birds and butterflies and everything else.
Yeah.
But I did want to thank you for your plan. It's been the most informative. We've looked at a lot of other plans. Of course, very few communities have been through what our communities have been through. And so there's actually very few plans that talk about what you do when a city has lost half of its trees.
Right.
And yours has been extremely informative. I'm going to get with you offline to talk about what worked and what didn't. But it's a great document, and I want to congratulate you for it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to ask about is, I was moderating a panel the other day with utilities officials, and with all the power lines in the public right of way, some people might think there need to be more aggressive pruning of trees in those areas. Is that possible while still maintaining those trees? I mean, is that kind of what would you say to that?
Well, utilities have changed their policies through the years. I mean, they used to be, I think looking at what is the ideal best practice for trimming, looking at shorter rotations for that. And I mean, there's just a lot of philosophy disagreements there on how often they should be pruned. In Des Moines, they plant large mature trees under lines and trim for that. So it just varies. I don't know what Julie, what do you guys do in Calgary as far as utility maintenance?
So all utility pruning is managed by the utility companies, but that's where we took the opportunity to really partner with them through the retreat effort and have those conversations about what are we doing and is it best practice, and being able to provide them with some of that information. And so they don't top trees the way they used to. It doesn't mean you won't find top trees in Calgary, because they're still there, because they were topped 10 years ago, right? But But it's really making sure that, and the other piece that we have is even as utilities go from above ground to below ground, continuing those conversations about setbacks. Everyone's very protective, and it always intrigues me. I think it's Portland that there's no setbacks, and I'm like, wow, how would you get that? But it also means the trees get torn out the minute that a utility needs to be repaired. And so we're working really closely with them to make sure we have the ability to replant that tree over top of a utility, and that if a utility is underground, how do we make sure that we both can benefit from that? Obviously, that utility is vital to the citizen in that community. And so we're working with a major telecom company right now that is bringing in fiber to premise, every single premise in Calgary. And they're bringing in 5G to follow that. And so how do we work with them to make sure that the canopy is preserved? Because my conversation with them, it feels like we're like this, but when you actually talk to them, we're both coming from the same standpoint. And they understand that we understand where they're bringing the citizens is valuable, and they understand that those citizens really love their trees, because when they ring on the doorbell and say, hey, we're going to be doing this, the people are like, not to my tree you are, right? So it's really, we've all come to that table, and it's conversations, and it's room for improvement, but it's the willingness to listen and hear some of those best practices.
I'm hopeful that this crisis in Iowa will, and particularly Cedar Rapids, will allow the conversation to reopen on a new tone with the utility company. I know that there's already a sense of partnership there, but certainly looking nationally, the typical American city and town, you're not allowed to plant significant trees where there are wires, and when the utility company comes in, you lose your tree. So I do think this is a real opportunity to talk about it again. And to, most utility companies are operating from a defensive stance. They're just trying to do their jobs and keep their wires clean and avoid hazards. But I think there can be a more careful interface between the tree and the wires in a way that we don't have to hobble our plant list.
We have great relationships and partnerships with, of course, Alliant Energy, Black Hills Energy, Mid-American. So we do have long-standing relationships. Much of that is around planting new trees. And we have done a lot of educational work on right tree, right place, and we'll continue to do that. I'm waiting to hear what kind of incredible cost the storm has levied on, say, Alliant. We had a previous ice storm that was like an $80 million cost. So, those linemen were out, linemen and women, they were out night and day, in spite of damage to their own homes. It was very impressive, the kind of relief, and how hard they were working across the whole state and the whole derecho area. But anyway, good partnerships. We'll be working on that for sure.
So we, down here, we work closely with Centerpoint Electric. For our Neighborhoods program, we do 15-gallon trees in city right-of-ways, and with participating neighborhoods, the resident gets to choose the species that they want. However, if there's power lines above their right-of-way, there's a slate of small trees that don't get much larger than about 20-25 feet for them to choose from. They're not allowed to choose from a larger slate, a slate of trees that grow much larger. That doesn't mean that we don't have mature live oaks that get up into the power lines, because we still have survivors. Personally, the utility folks, I really feel for them, because they're between a rock and the hard place. Nothing's worse than having all your power go out because a tree fell on it. But on the other hand, to see a live oak trimmed like this is hard to take for most people who don't understand that live oaks actually like to spread out. They do like to have the top of their heads there, but they do spread out. So they actually take to it pretty well. Palms, we actually live on a semi-tropical island, not a tropical island, but people like to see palms. If the palm grows up in the power lines, it's gone. There's nothing to There's no arguing about a palm. So,
Palms,
but at
palms
any
don't
rate,
provide it very much in terms of
no, they
ecosystem
don't. And palms
benefits
aren't
either.
trees.
They're not a tree, of course.
Yeah, so we don't need to get into that. But
I work
but
in a
we
lot
work
of
really closely. Centerpoint has sponsored our Neighborhoods program multiple years in a row, and they also send a big volunteer crew to plant.
Yeah.
the name Neighborhoods is fantastic, and I think in the sort of Shannon mentioned, the plan will be as good as its principles. I think an important opportunity this plan presents is to engage communities in their neighborhoods, in their communities.
Right.
That the underserved communities that have the fewest trees are the ones that suffer from the most asthma and the other negatives that can come from having a bad environment. And getting folks engaged to the degree that they're willing, to go into the neighborhood, to really activate them in rebuilding their own canopies, can be a great way to build social equity, or I should say social, what's the word I want? Social value in their communities. Social capital.
Yeah, just when I was doing some of my reporting about just Cedar Rapids and its loss of trees, I know that Cedar Rapids had a plan at some point where people could adopt a tree, and they would give you, so a resident that I talked with, she wanted a tree in 2003 to be planted in front of her house to kind of provide some shade to the porch and provide some habitat for animals. She reached out to the city, and they gave her a choice of like 2 or 3 trees, and she chose a heritage river birch, and that was planted in front of her house on F Avenue. And she got a little placard that said, "I am your tree." And then it said, "Help me grow by watering the soil around the trunk." And I just thought that was a fantastic thing that the city was doing, to kind of get people invested in helping to care for the trees in front of their houses. Is that something that's continued? Is that something that's done elsewhere?
I'll speak to that one. So that was part of the street tree program. And at that time, Cedar Rapids was responding more to requests for trees. And now, the focus is, yes, we're going to try. I mean, everything's changed, obviously. But we had been focusing on what neighborhoods have what canopy and need more trees, along with trying to respond to some of those individual requests. To plant a tree on the street, almost all the cities have some kind of a permitting process, and then also a list of preferred species, so you don't end up with, say, just undesirable trees that drop a lot of limbs and things on streets or fruit. So right now, Trees Forever is doing a residential adoption program in Cedar Rapids, and it is for Cedar Rapids residents, where we have a great list of native trees. Unfortunately, we have a limit. I think we're at 1,200 trees total this fall. And that's a lot to pull together just this quickly after the storm. But we felt like it would give people a little bit of a boost, and we're going to do that in Marion next spring, and other communities in the area that were hit hard. That's a good start. That's a place you can start. But we'll be looking at just some massive adoption programs and engagement, like Calgary's done with the neighborhoods, doing a lot of education and engagement. I personally love crowdsourcing, where people can like Julie was saying, go on, let's look at this tree on our street and put a comment on there, or name that tree. Encourage people to really adopt those trees as if they're adopting a pet,
Yeah, and it links back to that inventory. We have had, we weren't successful at bringing it in just because of at that era of thinking on technology with our internal data team, and the thinking has changed. But there's cities like Toronto who have put a the public can actually add to the tree inventory. And so they have that ability to add in. The city of Melbourne did, and we're looking at sort of duplicating it here. They did the emails to the trees. And they thought they were just going to get, oh, I need my limb pruned kind of here. And they got love letters, and they had, letters seeking advice on, this space means so much to me and my partner, and I really want to propose, and how do you think I go about doing it? And it was heartwarming, and it was amazing to read. And so there are so many ways that we can engage people, and they don't have to be homeowners. We, in past, ran a program very similar to the Neighborhoods program, and we did go away from it because as a city asset, it's our liability to maintain that asset. And we were finding that, similar to what Shannon said, is that it was going into the communities that were already the have communities. They were the ones that already had the large canopy. And we weren't getting the response that we were looking for in the communities that needed the equity in the canopy. And so we decided that based on the way the engagement worked, that there was better ways for us to do it. But that was very specific to Calgary and the populations and the languages that the populations speak in some of those communities, and finding different ways. But we work closely with our social community neighborhood teams to make sure that we get input from those communities, and that there is ways for the community gardens to access, that we're working with orchard programs with them that not only provides canopy but also food equity in those communities. And so I think there are so many ways for us to look at how a community can really be involved, and there are so many amazing lessons learned from all over the world. And it's just listening to those and figuring out how they fit in your own community.
Well, we are winding down here. I have one last question for our tremendous panel here, and it's kind of a fun one. I hope it's fun. I wanted to ask each panelist what their favorite tree is, what their favorite type of tree is, and why they love it. It can be one of your favorite. It doesn't have to be the absolute favorite, but I'll put Jeff on the spot. Can you go first?
Sure. My favorite tree is definitely the sycamore or London plane tree. You can distinguish it by its bark, so it's very easy to know the greenish bark. It's one of the first trees that my kids learned to identify. It's an extremely robust street tree. It's in almost every climate. It grows tremendously fast, and I have to say, I worked on some new communities, some towns that I helped plan 22 years ago that I visited recently. And those trees were planted less than 20 years ago, and there is a kissing canopy. The branches are touching now over the tops of the streets. So literally in 20 years, a beautiful canopy. I used to love ginkgo bilobas, but then I learned from Doug Tallamy that they don't provide any ecosystem benefits at all, so I don't love them anymore. Am I right, Shannon?
Geckos are still great trees, but yeah, Doug says you might as well have a sculpture.
What about you, Shannon?
Well, I think you guys have heard me talk about oaks. Of course, I love oaks. I grew up on the Gulf Coast, so I grew up climbing in live oaks and spent a lot of time in live oaks. They're amazing trees. However, Iowa's and the Midwest, bur oaks, probably going to come in as my favorite. There's a bur oak on a bluff in Peoria, Illinois, that's over 400 years old. It's protected with a cast iron fence. And it looks, it's got limbs laying on the ground. It's just amazing to think about the history around oaks. There are many council oaks where treaty talks were held, with Native Americans, and there's just a lot of history, and they feed a lot of critters.
Great. What about you, Julie?
I'm gonna be really specific. My favorite tree is I have a weeping birch in my backyard that I have watched my kids grow up in. Literally, I've watched as they've had to put the small little chair underneath to be able to reach the first limb, and now they sit at the top, and it's a weeping birch, so it moves. And they're like, "Look how high I am!" And it provides canopy over our backyard, and it provides so much habitat for nuthatches and flickers and chickadees and the crazy squirrels that are not native here. And so is it because of that species? I don't think so. It's because that particular tree has so much meaning to me and to my family. And because of it, my kids have a passion for that outdoors and for experiencing it. And they put their hand on the hip. That is not a woodpecker. That is a nuthatch. You know, because it's going head down and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, and you have these moments of pride where they defend it. And so that tree in particular, I think, is one of my favorite. And it's Calgary. So, you know, we've got 12 tree species that can grow here. So you can't pick one. We've got to live with what the few we have. So yeah, that one's mine.
All right, well, Priscilla, you get the last word.
So you'd think it would be live oak, and I do love live oaks and oaks, but my favorite tree is bald cypress, and specifically the bald cypress along the Riverwalk in San Antonio. But in general, one of the reasons I like it, I love them, is because they grow pretty fast here for our purposes. They're super wind resilient. They're drought resistant, and they can handle having their feet wet as well, because they're also in the swamps in Louisiana and East Texas. They also are one of, or if the only, deciduous conifers. So in the fall, even here in warm Texas, they'll turn some really cool rusty red colors in the fall. And their leaves are so tiny and small that they make some of the best compost you could ever have. What else do I love? Oh, habitat, you know, wildlife habitat. And the really old ones get tall, they grow tall and pyramidal, and as they reach maturity, they're the tops of the canopies kind of flatten off, and they're just dramatic. I love them.
Well, that's a great way to end this conversation here. I just am so grateful for this panel that we've been able to come together and have this conversation here on a lovely Friday in the fall. And I feel like the information they've shared is going to be really helpful in helping Eastern Iowa communities move forward with reforestation. So thank you to Julie, Priscilla, Jeff, and Shannon. We have some other great sessions today, including the next one, which is about local climate action plans. So that starts at 9:45 a.m. So thanks again to you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be with you all.